The town of Concord in the early 19th century was a place where morning light crept gently over wooden fences and the smell of dew-soaked grass lingered in the air. The streets were unpaved, and on a still day you could hear the distant murmur of the Concord River as it moved slowly between its banks. In this quiet corner of Massachusetts, life unfolded in small, deliberate rhythms. Farmers walked their fields, shopkeepers opened their shutters, and children ran barefoot through orchards heavy with apples. It was a world not yet touched by the rush of industry, where the seasons marked time as surely as the church bell on Sunday morning. This was the landscape that shaped a boy named Henry David Thoreau, born on July 12, 1817. His family lived in a modest house on Virginia Road, a home filled with the scent of bread baking and the scratch of pencils. His father, John, was a pencil maker who worked in a small shed behind the house. Henry was the third of 4 children, and from his earliest years, he showed a deep curiosity for the natural world that surrounded him. He would wander through the meadows and woodlands of Concord, picking wildflowers and watching the flight patterns of birds. His mother, Cynthia, a spirited woman with a love for storytelling, encouraged his questions and read to him from books of natural philosophy. In that childhood, the boundaries between indoors and outdoors seemed to dissolve. Henry felt as comfortable under a canopy of elm leaves as he did by the fireside. The town itself was steeped in a quiet intellectual tradition. Concord had been settled by Puritans, and its citizens valued learning and moral seriousness, yet there was also a gentle tolerance for individuality. The meeting house stood on the town square, a whitewashed structure where discussions of civic duty often mixed with theological debate. Beyond the center, fields of rye and corn stretched toward the horizon, dotted with stands of white pine and oak. The landscape was a patchwork of cultivated land and wild forest, and young Henry studied it as other boys might study a map of foreign lands. He knew the exact spot where the first skunk cabbage pushed through the snow in early spring, and he could identify the song of a veery thrush from 100 yards away. As he grew older, Henry's mind sharpened. He attended the Concord Academy, where he excelled in classical languages and developed a precise, almost musical way with words. But it was the hours outside the classroom that defined him most. Late afternoons found him floating in a rowboat on the Sudbury River, letting the current carry him while he observed the dance of water striders on the still surface. The light at dusk turned the water into a sheet of bronze, and the silhouettes of herons stood like sentinels along the reedy shore. These moments were not just idle recreation. They were the seedbed of a philosophy that would later grow into something luminous and world-changing. Concord in the 1820s and 1830s was also a crossroads for new ideas. The air was electric with the currents of transcendentalism, a philosophical movement that held that every person carries an inner spark of the divine, and that ultimate truth is found by communing with nature. Leading thinkers gathered in the parlors of Concord homes, and young Henry, quiet and watchful, absorbed their conversations like a sponge. He began to see the landscape around him not just as a collection of things, but as a living text, waiting to be read by anyone willing to pay attention. The ordinary became extraordinary. A spider's web glistening with morning dew contained as much wisdom as a library of books. His relationship with his older brother John was one of the deepest bonds of his life. Together they roamed the woods, shared journals, and dreamed of opening a school that would teach children by walking with them through fields and forests rather than confining them to a stuffy room. The two brothers would sit on the banks of the Concord River at night, watching the reflection of stars ripple on the water, talking softly about what makes a life worth living. In those conversations under the vast, dark sky, Henry first articulated his belief that simplicity is not poverty, but a kind of wealth the world rarely recognizes. The seeds of Walden were being planted, though the pond itself was still a few miles away and years in the future. In the autumn of 1833, at the age of 16, Henry David Thoreau traveled the short distance from Concord to Cambridge to enter Harvard College. The journey was less than 20 miles, yet it carried him into a different atmosphere entirely, one of brick and ivy, of lecture halls and Latin recitations, of young men in dark coats hurrying across courtyards between tolling bells. For a boy raised in the open fields of Concord, the containment of college life could feel like a cage, but Henry adapted with his characteristic quiet determination. He was not a standout student by the formal measures of the day, yet his intellect burned steadily behind his reserved manner. He read widely, studying Greek and Roman classics in their original languages, and he developed a particular fondness for the contemplative works of the Stoic philosophers. The Harvard years brought him into contact with voices that would echo through his own thinking for the rest of his life. He encountered the writings of Jean-Jacques Rousseau and the German idealists, and he began to shape a philosophy that questioned the materialism he saw arising in America. But his real education, as he later reflected, happened less in the library and more in the moments of quiet observation stolen between classes. He would slip away from the campus to walk along the banks of the Charles River, where the city's noise faded into a gentle murmur and the willows dipped their branches into the slow-moving water. There, in the soft light of a Massachusetts afternoon, he continued the education of his senses that Concord had begun. After graduating in 1837, Thoreau returned home with a diploma in hand, but without the fiery ambition that drove many of his classmates toward careers in law, medicine, or the ministry. Instead, he rejoined the rhythms of his family's household and began to seek out mentorship from the one mind in Concord that shone most brightly to him. That mind belonged to Ralph Waldo Emerson, a former minister turned essayist and lecturer who had recently published a slim volume titled Nature that would become the cornerstone of American transcendentalism. Emerson lived in a large, comfortable house on the Cambridge Turnpike, and he welcomed the young graduate into his circle with a generosity that would shape Thoreau's entire creative trajectory. The friendship between Emerson and Thoreau was not one of equals, at least not at first. Emerson was 14 years older, already a public figure, a man whose words carried weight in intellectual circles. Thoreau was the quiet pupil, the listener with the sharp, probing eyes. Yet Emerson recognized something exceptional in the younger man, a fierce independence of thought, a directness of perception that seemed to bypass all convention. The two would take long walks together through Walden woods, discussing the nature of the soul and the meaning of a well-lived life. Under Emerson's influence, Thoreau began to keep a journal in earnest, not a diary of events, but a daily record of observations, thoughts, and the slow unfolding of his inner world. That journal would become the deepest well from which all his future books would be drawn. During these years, Thoreau tried his hand at teaching, first in the public schools of Concord, then in a small private academy he opened with his brother John. The brothers' school was a place of sunlight and open windows, where lessons in botany took place in the meadows and history was taught not from dry textbooks, but through storytelling and conversation. The school flourished for a time, and the bond between the brothers deepened, until a sudden illness struck John in 1842, and he died within a matter of days. The loss cut through Henry like a winter wind through bare branches. He withdrew into silence for a spell, grieving in the privacy of his walks through the woods, and he learned something about the fragility of life that would inform his commitment to live each day with extraordinary attention. In the aftermath of John's death, Thoreau drifted toward a simpler way of supporting himself. He worked in his father's pencil factory, where he applied his curious mind to improving the manufacturing process, experimenting with clay binders and graphite mixtures until Thoreau pencils became known for their exceptional quality. The work was honest and physical, and it taught him something about the dignity of labor done with care. But even as his hands shaped pencils, his mind was shaping something else. The idea was beginning to crystallize in his imagination, to strip life down to its essentials, to go into the woods and live deliberately, with no aim but to uncover what it truly means to be alive. He began to walk the shores of a deep, clear pond called Walden, hearing the lapping of water against the stones like a quiet invitation. In the spring of 1845, Henry David Thoreau borrowed an axe and walked into the woods on the northwestern shore of Walden Pond. The land belonged to his friend and mentor Emerson, who had given tacit permission for the experiment, though neither man knew exactly what shape it would take. Thoreau selected a site on a gentle rise, not far from the water's edge, where the morning sun would flood the clearing and the whisper of wind through white pines would be a constant companion. The soil was light and well-drained, tucked among hickories and birches that had stood there for decades. He spent the first days clearing the underbrush, swinging the axe with a steady rhythm that sent birds scattering into the canopy, and gradually the outline of a small house began to appear on the forest floor. The building process was slow and deliberate, a meditation in wood and nails. Thoreau worked alone most days, his only clock the movement of shadows across the pond. He cut white pine logs from a stand of trees nearby, hewing them into timbers with the same careful attention he had once applied to improving pencil leads. Friends sometimes wandered by to offer a hand or share a loaf of bread, but the work belonged primarily to his own two hands. He framed the house to be 10 feet wide by 15 feet long, less than many tool sheds in the town, with a door facing south to catch the low winter sun, and a window on the opposite wall to frame the view of the water. The simplicity of the design was not born of poverty, but of an intense clarity about what a person truly needs. By the 4th of July, the cabin was habitable, though not yet finished. Thoreau moved in with a few pieces of furniture: a bed, a table, a desk, 3 chairs, a small looking-glass, and a cooking pot. He built a fireplace of rough stone that would keep him warm through the long New England winter, and he swept the floor clean with a birch broom he fashioned himself. The first night at Walden, he wrote in his journal about the profound stillness that settled over the pond as darkness fell, broken only by the occasional call of a whippoorwill and the distant hoot of an owl. He slept with the windows open to the scent of pine and damp earth, feeling no separation between his own breathing and the gentle respiration of the woods around him. Life in the cabin quickly assumed a natural rhythm. In the mornings, he would wake as the first light touched the water, step outside, and bathe in the pond, feeling the cool silk of the water against his skin. There was no clock to punch, no bell to answer. The day stretched before him like an unmarked page. He tended a bean field that occupied about 2.5 acres of cleared land on a sunny slope above the house. The work of planting, hoeing, and harvesting was light enough to leave his mind free, and Thoreau found that the repetitive motions of farm labor created a space in which deep thoughts could grow. As his hands worked, his mind wandered through the great questions of philosophy and back to the simple observation of a dewdrop hanging from a leaf tip. His diet during those first weeks consisted mainly of what he could grow or gather: beans, corn, peas, potatoes, and a bit of bread he baked himself in an iron pot. Occasionally, he caught fish from the pond, but early on he began to feel a growing unease about taking life, even of the simplest creatures, and he gradually moved toward a vegetarian diet, finding nourishment in the wild fruits and nuts the woods offered freely. His cooking was basic, often a single pot simmering over the fire, but he experienced each meal with a gratitude that richer fare had never provoked. Eating became a form of communion, a daily acknowledgement of his dependence on the soil and the sun. As summer turned to autumn, the woods around Walden transformed into a cathedral of color, the maples blazing red and orange, the birches turning a soft gold that seemed to catch the late afternoon light and hold it. Thoreau spent these days walking, observing, recording. He measured the depth of the pond with a weighted line, sketched the bottom contours in his journal, and learned the topography of Walden as intimately as a sailor knows his coastline. He noted the arrival and departure of migratory birds, the blooming times of wildflowers, the exact angle of the sun on the equinox. His cabin became a lens through which he focused an entire universe of detail, and the boundary between the observer and the observed grew thinner with each passing day. A typical day for Thoreau at Walden began in the soft darkness before dawn. He would rise, stir the embers in the stone fireplace, and step outside into the cool air, his bare feet feeling the dew-dampened grass. Standing at the water's edge, he watched the pond awaken, a thin mist rising from the surface, the first bird-song stitching through the silence, the gradual lightening of the eastern sky from deep indigo to pale rose. He often wrote of these mornings as the most precious part of the day, calling them the waking hour, when the senses are most receptive and the mind is still unburdened by the clutter of daily concerns. The pond, he observed, was never the same 2 mornings in a row. It changed with the weather, the season, the angle of light, and he felt it was teaching him something about constancy within change. After his morning bath in the pond, which served both as a physical refreshment and a kind of baptismal ritual, Thoreau would set about his domestic tasks. He swept the floor with his broom, drew water, prepared a simple breakfast that might consist of cornmeal porridge sweetened with wild berries. Often he would read for an hour or two, seated in the one chair by the south-facing door, with the morning sun falling across the pages. His library was small. He kept only a few volumes in the cabin, preferring to use the great collections of Concord and Cambridge when needed, but the few he kept he read so deeply that their ideas became part of the fabric of his thought. Homer and the Hindu scriptures lay beside his own journal, the yellowed pages filling with his small, precise handwriting. The morning work in the bean field was never rushed. Thoreau moved between the rows with a hoe, the sun warming his back, and he let his mind roam freely. These hours of agricultural labor, he discovered, were not an interruption of his intellectual life, but an extension of it. As his hoe cut through the soil, he was thinking about economics, about the relation of labor to leisure, about the madness of a society that worked frantic hours to acquire goods that brought no lasting satisfaction. The beans themselves became symbols, planted, tended, harvested. They followed a logic that the marketplace ignored, a logic of seasons, of patience, of sufficiency rather than excess. He would later calculate that his food for the entire year cost him less than $29, and that the time he spent earning that sum was but a fraction of what others labored simply to maintain a style of living they did not need. Afternoons were for walking. Sometimes he followed the shoreline of the pond, winding his way around coves and through thickets where the wild grapes hung in heavy purple clusters. Other days he struck out into the surrounding countryside, visiting the small farms and hamlets within a 10-mile radius. He was known to his neighbors as the man who lives alone at the pond, a figure of mild curiosity, but they welcomed him at their kitchen tables and shared the news of the district. Thoreau received these social calls with friendliness, but never with dependence. He valued his solitude as a musician values silence, as the ground from which true connection can arise. Returning to his cabin as the sun sank low, he would often pause at the top of the slope leading down to the water and simply watch the light change, the long shadows of pines stretching across the mirror-like surface, the sky deepening through layers of gold and violet. He kept a journal with monk-like discipline. The act of writing was for him not a report of what he had done, but a way of seeing more clearly. His entries moved seamlessly from the minute "the pitch pine cones are open this morning," showing their mahogany scales, to the universal "I love to be alone." I never found the companion that was so companionable as solitude. The journal was not written for publication. It was the raw ore from which his books would later be refined. But even in its unpolished state, it shimmered with a clarity that marks the great observer. He found that the act of putting a perception into words had a way of solidifying it, of transforming a fleeting impression into a permanent landmark in the geography of his mind. Winter at Walden was a time of deep quiet. The pond froze into a vast pane of crystal, and Thoreau could walk out onto the ice and feel himself suspended between the dark water below and the pale sky above. He kept a fire crackling in the hearth, and at night the flame cast dancing shadows on the unfinished plank walls while the wind rattled the one pane of the window. During those months, visitors were rare, and the solitude took on a different quality, more inward, more reflective. He read by candlelight until his eyes tired, then stepped outside one more time to see the stars blazing in the cold, clear air. The Pleiades hung like a cluster of distant lanterns, and the silence was so complete that he could hear the faint creak of the ice expanding. In such moments, he felt what he called a sympathy with the fluttering alder and poplar leaves, a sense that he was not apart from the world, but woven into it, a single thread in a tapestry of infinite complexity. The 2 years, 2 months, and 2 days that Thoreau spent living in the cabin by the pond generated a wealth of raw material, journal entries numbering in the hundreds of thousands of words. When he returned to Concord in the autumn of 1847, Carrying his few possessions and a trunk full of notebooks, the real work of shaping that material into a book began. He moved back into his family's house on Main Street and took a room that looked out over a quiet garden where he could sit at a small desk with the afternoon light falling across his papers. The transition from the solitude of Walden to the rhythms of domestic life was not jarring but gentle, a gradual adjustment that Thoreau accepted as another chapter in the same experiment in living. The manuscript that would become Walden, or Life in the Woods, went through 7 full revisions over the course of several years. Thoreau approached the rewriting with the patience of a carpenter sanding a piece of fine wood, working each sentence until it had the smooth, depth-revealing quality of the pond itself. He compressed the 2-year experience into a single seasonal cycle, beginning with the summer of building and ending with the spring thaw when the pond ice cracked and boomed like a creature waking from hibernation. This structure gave the book the shape of a natural year, a circle of death and rebirth that echoed the larger cycles of the natural world he so loved. During these years of revision, Thoreau also labored over other writings. The essay Resistance to Civil Government, later known as Civil Disobedience, was born from a singular, quiet act of protest. In the summer of 1846, while he was still living at the pond, Thoreau was stopped by the local constable, Sam Staples, and asked to pay several years' worth of poll tax. Thoreau declined, not out of poverty, but out of principle. He would not support a government that permitted slavery and waged a war of aggression against Mexico. He spent one night in the Concord jail, a night he later described as remarkably peaceful, during which he could still hear the sounds of the town through the barred window. A friend paid the tax against his wishes, and he was released the next morning, but the experience crystallized his thinking about the individual's relationship to the state. The resulting essay, published in 1849, argued with calm precision that conscience must take precedence over law and that the most powerful tool of protest is non-cooperation. But it was Walden that consumed his deepest attention. He read chapters aloud to his family in the parlor, testing the music of the prose. The book developed into a structure of 18 chapters, each a facet of the jewel he was polishing. In Economy, he laid out the practical details of his experiment with the rigor of an accountant, demonstrating that a life of simplicity was not only philosophically sound but materially achievable. In Reading, he mused on the importance of great books and urged the people of Concord to read the classics in their original languages as a way of overcoming the provincialism of their time. In Sounds, he abandoned visual description entirely to construct a symphony of the world as heard through the open window of his cabin, the distant chime of church bells, the whistle of the train on the Fitchburg line, the haunting call of the screech owl, the buzz of a mosquito. The chapter Solitude stands as one of the most famous meditations on being alone ever written. Thoreau did not portray solitude as loneliness. He painted it as a rich and nourishing state in which the mind can expand to its full dimensions. "I love to be alone," he wrote, and then qualified with a gentle paradox. "I never found the companion that was so companionable as solitude." In those pages, the pond becomes a person, the pine trees are friends, and even the rain that falls on the roof of the cabin speaks with a voice. He was not retreating from the world, he explained, but drawing closer to its essential truths. The isolation of Walden was a lens that concentrated his attention, and through that lens the smallest detail, a loon's laugh echoing across the water, the pattern of ice crystals on the window, revealed layers of meaning that most people rush past every day. In 1854, after 7 years of painstaking labor, Walden was published by the Boston firm of Ticknor and Fields. The reception was modest. It sold fewer than 2,000 copies in its first year and earned Thoreau a total of a few $100s, far less than the value of the beans he had raised, he once joked. But the book did not need immediate commercial success to fulfill its purpose. It was a slow-burning fire, a book that readers would discover in attic libraries and second-hand bookshops for generations to come. Some reviewers dismissed it as the work of an eccentric, a hermit who had turned his back on society, but they missed the point. Walden was never a manual for escape. It was a call to awake, a quiet, insistent voice urging each person to examine their own life with the same clarity that Thoreau had brought to his study of the pond. The years after Walden's publication were not marked by grand events or dramatic transformations in Thoreau's life. He continued to live in Concord, mostly in the family home, and he kept up his long walks through the woods and fields with a devotion that never wavered. The journal grew thicker, eventually filling more than 2 million words over the course of his life. He became a sought-after lecturer, traveling to nearby towns and sometimes as far as New York City to deliver talks that were part nature essay, part philosophical meditation, and part gentle provocation. Those who heard him speak described a singular presence, a lean, middle-sized man with a strong nose and deep-set eyes that seemed to look not at you, but through you, into some landscape of thought only he could see. He became increasingly active in the anti-slavery movement, and his moral clarity on the issue drew admiration from a new generation of abolitionists. He wrote impassioned defenses of John Brown after the raid on Harper's Ferry, delivering a lecture titled "A Plea for Captain John Brown" that shocked polite society with its uncompromising tone. Thoreau never softened his principles to win approval. He believed, with the same calm certainty he applied to observing a turtle on a log, that the human conscience must not bend to unjust laws. Yet even in his most political moments, his language remained rooted in the natural world. When speaking of freedom, he spoke also of the unchained river, the unhindered flight of the hawk. In the late 1850s, Thoreau's health began to weaken. The tuberculosis that had lingered in his lungs since his youth grew more insistent, bringing spells of coughing and fatigue that confined him to his bed for longer and longer periods. He faced the decline with the same methodical attention he had given to the changing of the seasons. He continued to write, dictating letters and journal entries to his sister Sophia when he could no longer hold the pen himself. His room became a quiet chamber filled with afternoon light, the window open to the smell of the Concord River and the sound of birds in the garden. Visitors came and went with gentle footsteps, and Thoreau received them with a serenity that touched everyone who sat by his bedside. The final months of 1861 and early 1862 were a time of slow, deliberate leave-taking. He corresponded with old friends, arranged his manuscripts, and gave instructions for the posthumous publication of his works. He spoke of death with a naturalist's curiosity, unafraid, as if it were another pond to be explored, another depth to be sounded. When asked about the afterlife in his last days, he replied with a quiet smile that he had no quarrel with God. On the morning of May 6, 1862, with the spring light filtering through the curtains and his sister by his side, Henry David Thoreau died at the age of 44. His final, unlabored words were reported to be moose and Indian fragments from the woods and wanderings he had loved, trailing into silence like the last echo of a bird call at dusk. He was buried in Sleepy Hollow Cemetery in Concord, on a gentle slope shaded by pines and hemlocks. The grave lies near those of his transcendentalist friends, Emerson, Hawthorne, the Alcotts, forming a quiet neighborhood of thinkers on what is now known as Authors' Ridge. The site is a place of pilgrimage for those who have found in Thoreau's writings a compass for their own lives. The stone is simple, inscribed with his name and the single word Henry, as if no other title were needed for a man who defined himself by his inner life rather than external accomplishments. The wind that moves through the branches above the graves carries the same whisper that stirred the pines at Walden. The legacy of Henry David Thoreau is not to be measured in sales figures or academic citations. It lives in every person who has ever paused on a woodland path to watch a spider spin its web, in every reader who has closed Walden and felt a quiet resolve to simplify, to attend more closely to the texture of daily existence. His ideas about civil disobedience would travel around the world, shaping the methods of nonviolent resistance used by Mahatma Gandhi and Martin Luther King Jr. His ethic of deliberate living would inspire generations of environmentalists, back to the land movements, and seekers of all stripes. But perhaps his deepest gift is simply the reminder, offered in a voice as calm and clear as pond water, that the mass of men lead lives of quiet desperation, and that there is another way, a way of attention, of simplicity, of waking up. As twilight settles over Walden Pond today, the same light glows that Thoreau described more than a century and a half ago. The water still mirrors the sky, the pines still rustle in the evening breeze, and the path that leads from the road to the cabin site is worn smooth by the feet of countless visitors who come to stand in the quiet clearing and listen. The cabin is gone. It was moved after his departure and later dismantled, but a cairn of stones, built stone by pilgrims, marks the spot where his simple house once stood. Each stone placed there is a small act of remembrance, a quiet acknowledgement that the example of one person living deliberately can ripple outward across time, touching lives still to be born, offering rest and clarity to all who seek a deeper way of being in the world.